Meaning is not given, it is forged under pressure. Carl Sagan understood this before most people were ready to face it. He looked into a universe that offered no special privilege to humanity, no guaranteed comfort, no promise that we stood at the center of anything. And still, he did not retreat into despair. He chose clarity. He chose responsibility. He chose wonder without illusion. That is what makes Sagan unsettling. He strips away a fantasy many people secretly need. The fantasy that the universe was designed to notice us, protect us, or explain us. For him, the cosmos is vast, silent, and indifferent. But that silence is not a sentence of meaninglessness. It is a demand. It demands that human beings grow up. It demands that we stop waiting for purpose to arrive from outside and begin creating it through thought, character, and the way we treat one another. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. In 2025, this question has not weakened. It has become sharper. We live surrounded by information, yet still flee from truth. We have more tools, yet remain vulnerable to illusion, vanity, and self-deception. Sagan saw this danger clearly. He knew that knowledge without humility becomes arrogance, and that civilization without moral seriousness becomes fragile. So to understand Carl Sagan is not merely to understand a scientist. It is to confront a discipline of mind and a code of human responsibility. And that is precisely where the deeper journey begins. Existence was never designed to comfort you. That is the first wound Carl Sagan forces open. The universe does not bend toward human longing. It does not pause for our grief. It does not arrange stars to reassure our fear. And yet, this is exactly where Sagan begins, not with despair, but with a harder demand. If the cosmos was not made for us, then what will we do with the brief consciousness we have been given inside it? Before many people were willing to face the emotional cost of modern science, Sagan had already looked straight into the cold scale of the universe and refused to blink. He saw what earlier ages fought to deny. Humanity is not the center. Earth is not the throne. Consciousness is not proof of cosmic privilege. We are a late emergence on a minor world, orbiting an ordinary star, drifting in a galaxy that itself is only one among countless others. This truth is not poetic decoration. It is a philosophical blade. It strips the human ego of its oldest fantasy. What makes this unbearable is not only the size of the universe, it is the insult hidden inside that size. We want to believe we matter because we are seen. We want meaning to come from outside, from some vast intelligence, some moral architecture built into the fabric of things. We want the universe to notice us. Sagan reveals something far more severe. The universe may contain wonder beyond measure, but it does not revolve around human need. It is not cruel. Cruelty would require intention. It is simply indifferent. And indifference wounds more deeply than hostility, because hostility still grants importance to its target. Indifference gives you nothing. This is the first philosophical shock. The universe does not exist to validate your existence. The explanation follows with force. Human beings inherited myths that placed them near the center of reality. Religions, empires, and collective fantasies repeatedly told the same comforting story. We are chosen. We are watched. We are central. But science kept dismantling these illusions one by one. The Earth was not the center of the solar system. The solar system was not the center of the galaxy. The galaxy was not the center of anything. Each discovery was not merely astronomical, it was psychological. It humiliated the species. The common misunderstanding is that this humiliation makes life meaningless. Sagan refuses that conclusion. He does not deny the wound. He denies the childish demand beneath it. Meaning does not disappear because centrality disappears. It only stops being handed to us as a gift. And the conclusion lands with full weight. You are not important because the universe was made for you. You become important by what you do inside a universe that was not. This is where Sagan becomes more than a scientist. He becomes an existential thinker in scientific language. He does not ask how to preserve old consolations. He asks whether the human mind can mature beyond them. Can we live without the narcotic of cosmic favoritism? Can we accept that we are small without collapsing into nihilism? Can we face insignificance without becoming morally empty? These are not technical questions. They are spiritual confrontations stripped of sentimental disguise. The second blow cuts even deeper. Human beings are not the center, and this is not a tragedy. It is a correction. Sagan understood that egocentrism does not only distort astronomy, it distorts ethics. The species that imagines itself central easily imagines itself entitled. It treats its perspective as absolute, its survival as sacred, its instincts as justified. Once that illusion is broken, humility becomes possible. Not soft humility, not ceremonial humility, structural humility, the kind that changes how you think, how you judge, how you treat the fragile fact of life. The explanation sharpens here. To know that we are cosmically small is not to reduce human dignity. It is to remove its counterfeit version. Dignity does not come from being the center of the universe. It comes from being conscious inside it. It comes from a mind able to ask questions in the dark. It comes from a creature that can know it is small and still choose responsibility. The misunderstanding is persistent. Many people think humility means self-erasure. Sagan shows the opposite. Humility is the beginning of proportion. It rescues us from delusion and returns us to reality. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. You do not become less noble by giving up the fantasy of cosmic centrality. You become more honest. Now, the deeper tension begins. If the universe offers no built-in meaning, then where does meaning come from? This is the question weaker minds try to escape. They rush toward comfort, They cling to certainty. They manufacture cosmic stories large enough to protect them from silence. Sagan takes the harder road. Meaning is not discovered waiting in the stars like a hidden inscription. It is created through consciousness, responsibility, love, inquiry, and moral choice. Not invented in the cheap sense, not arbitrarily selected like a costume, but forged through the encounter between a finite being and an indifferent cosmos. This is the third assertion, and it is the most demanding. Meaning is not given, it must be made. The explanation follows without mercy. If no external structure guarantees value, then value becomes a human task. If the universe does not issue moral commands, then moral seriousness must arise from our awareness of fragility, suffering, interdependence, and truth. Sagan does not retreat into relativism here. He does not say that anything can mean anything. He says that because there is no cosmic parent arranging significance for us, our responsibility becomes greater, not smaller. The misunderstanding is fatal. People hear that meaning is not built into the universe and assume that nothing matters. That is intellectual laziness disguised as courage. Sagan rejects it completely. The absence of given meaning does not empty life. It exposes your role in shaping it. And the conclusion cuts clean. A silent universe does not absolve you. It indicts your passivity. This is why Sagan's thought still strikes the modern mind with unusual force. Even in 2025, with all our technology, all our data, all our simulated confidence, the old hunger remains the same. We still want existence to come pre-interpreted. We still want the world to reassure us that our pain has a guaranteed place in some larger order. We still confuse emotional need with truth. We still ask reality to soften itself around our fear. Sagan refuses. He demands adulthood at the scale of civilization. And adulthood begins with this unbearable recognition. The cosmos is vast beyond intuitive comprehension, and nothing in that vastness owes you comfort. But that same recognition reveals something else. If meaning is not imposed from above, then every act of understanding becomes more precious. Every act of tenderness becomes less trivial. Every effort to reduce cruelty becomes more urgent. In a universe that does not promise justice, justice becomes a human achievement. In a universe that does not promise meaning, meaning becomes a human construction under pressure. This is where the psychological core of Sagan's vision emerges. Human beings fear insignificance more than they fear error. They would rather believe a flattering lie than endure an unadorned truth. Why? Because insignificance feels like erasure. It feels like disappearance. If we are small, if we are not central, if the stars do not carry our name, then what protects us from the terror that our lives might pass without consequence? Sagan confronts that terror directly. Nothing protects you from it except the quality of your own response. That is the real demand, not belief, response. What do you become when the universe does not flatter you? Do you become bitter? Do you become cynical? Do you become careless because no cosmic witness is keeping score? Or do you become more awake, more disciplined, more humane, precisely because nothing guarantees that goodness will survive unless you practice it. Sagan's greatness lies here. He does not romanticize cosmic indifference, but he does not flee from it either. He transforms it into an ethical challenge. If we are alone, then our treatment of one another matters more. If we are small, then our violence becomes more absurd. If consciousness is rare, then every conscious life carries a gravity that no mythology needs to exaggerate. Through Sagan, the universe loses its role as a comforting parent and becomes something harsher and greater, a field of reality in which human maturity must be earned. Consider the symbolic figure of Sagan himself, not merely a popular scientist, but a mind standing between wonder and severity. Through him, we see that intellectual honesty does not require emotional emptiness. He looked at the silence of the cosmos and did not conclude that love was foolish. He looked at human smallness and did not conclude that ethics was optional. He looked at a universe without guaranteed purpose and did not surrender the question of how to live. That is the real strength. Not optimism, not pessimism, moral steadiness without illusion. And that steadiness is rare because most people cannot endure unanswered scale. They can endure suffering more easily than they can endure meaninglessness. So they reduce the universe to a story they can survive emotionally. They reach for false certainties, cosmic favoritism, shallow spiritual vanity, anything to avoid the simple fact that reality is under no obligation to affirm them. Sagan strips all of this away. He demands that we grow strong enough to stand inside truth without decoration. The result is not despair. It is a more disciplined form of wonder, a wonder no longer dependent on fantasy, a reverence no longer based on projection. The stars do not need to love you to be magnificent. Reality does not need to center you to be sacred in a deeper sense. The beauty becomes harsher, but also cleaner, less sentimental, more real. And once you accept this, another difficulty appears. If human beings are not naturally central, if meaning is not supplied in advance, then one more illusion must be confronted with equal force. The mind itself cannot be trusted simply because it wants to believe. The need for meaning makes us vulnerable to error. The hunger for comfort makes us easy to deceive. And the next battle is no longer only against cosmic silence, but against the dangerous ease with which human consciousness turns desire into false knowledge. The most dangerous lie is the one your own mind whispers in your own voice. That is where Carl Sagan turns the blade next. After stripping away the fantasy that the universe was built to comfort us, he forces us into a more intimate and humiliating confrontation. The threat is not only out there in the cold silence of the cosmos. It is in here, inside the machinery of thought itself. The human mind does not simply seek truth. It also seeks relief. It seeks coherence. It seeks protection from uncertainty. And because of that, it can deceive itself with terrifying ease. This is the wound most people do not want opened. They are willing to hear that the universe is vast. They are willing to hear that humanity is small. But they resist the deeper insult. Their own certainty cannot be trusted simply because it feels sincere. Their conviction is not proof. Their intensity is not evidence. Their emotional clarity is not truth. Sagan understood this with unusual severity. He knew that a species capable of asking magnificent questions is also capable of manufacturing magnificent errors. What does it mean to doubt in the right way? It does not mean cynical paralysis. It does not mean rejecting everything. It means refusing to worship your first impression. It means accepting that the mind produces illusions not only in ignorance, but in confidence. It means learning that the feeling of being right may be one of the most misleading feelings a human being can experience. The first assertion lands hard. The brain is built for survival before it is built for truth. The explanation follows with force. Human cognition did not emerge in order to produce perfect objectivity. It emerged under pressure, in danger, in urgency, in environments where fast judgment often mattered more than careful accuracy. The mind learned to simplify, to generalize, to fill in gaps, to mistake patterns for certainty. These habits helped the species survive, but they also made it vulnerable to false belief. The misunderstanding is common and dangerous. People assume that because a thought appears naturally, it carries authority. Sagan destroys that illusion. What appears naturally may simply reflect an old mental shortcut, a protective reflex, a primitive hunger for order. And the conclusion cuts clean. Natural belief is not the same as justified belief. The second assertion drives deeper. Feeling convinced is not the same as being correct. The explanation sharpens. Human beings often experience confidence long before they possess evidence. In fact, confidence frequently grows strongest where scrutiny is weakest. Why? Because doubt is painful. Uncertainty destabilizes identity. The mind prefers a bad answer over an open question, if that bad answer restores emotional equilibrium. The misunderstanding here is almost universal. People trust inner certainty because it feels intimate, immediate, personal. But Sagan understood that intimacy is not verification. A lie can feel deeply authentic if it answers a deep emotional need. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The sensation of truth is not truth. This is where necessary skepticism becomes moral, not merely intellectual. Because if the mind is prone to self-deception, then unquestioned belief is not innocence, it is negligence. Sagan does not tell us to distrust reason. He tells us to distrust undisciplined certainty. He asks a harder question. What methods have you built to protect yourself from yourself? What habits of thought stand between your hunger for comfort and your claim to truth? Without such habits, intelligence itself becomes dangerous. A clever mind can rationalize almost anything once it falls in love with a conclusion. The third assertion strips away another illusion. To seek truth, you must learn to suspect your own preferences. The explanation follows without mercy. Most people do not begin inquiry from neutrality. They begin from desire. They want the world to be a certain way. They want their group to be right. They want their fear to be justified, or their hope to be protected. Then they gather fragments that support what they already need to believe. Sagan saw this pattern everywhere: in superstition, in conspiracy, in pseudoscience, in ideology, in ordinary daily thinking. The misunderstanding is flattering. People imagine deception comes mainly from outside, from manipulators, institutions, enemies. But the first deceiver is often the self. The conclusion lands with full severity. If you do not question your own motives for believing, your search for truth is already corrupted. This is why skepticism in Sagan's vision is not a fashionable pose. It is psychological discipline. It is the refusal to let desire dress itself as knowledge. It is the courage to ask not only whether something is comforting, but whether it is true. And those are often not the same question. Now, the modern mind should feel the pressure closing in, because this problem did not disappear with education, technology, or access to information. In 2025, it has only become more sophisticated. People carry entire universes of data in their hands, yet remain deeply vulnerable to distortion. Why? Because misinformation does not succeed only by hiding facts. It succeeds by seducing emotional patterns already present in the mind. It flatters resentment. It rewards fear. It confirms vanity. It offers certainty where reality offers complexity. And the human brain, exhausted by ambiguity, often surrenders. Sagan would not be surprised. He knew that the enemy of truth is not only ignorance, it is the comfort of premature closure. A person can be highly informed and still intellectually undisciplined. A society can be technologically advanced and still mentally childish. Information alone does not save a mind that cannot examine its own hunger to believe. This is where the existential depth of skepticism appears. To doubt yourself properly is not a technical exercise. It is an assault on ego. It means you accept that your perceptions can mislead you, your memory can distort, your emotions can bias, your certainty can betray. It means you stop treating your inner life as sacred evidence and start treating it as material to be examined. Why is this so difficult? Because the self wants coherence before it wants truth. It wants to feel intact. It wants its story preserved. The moment real skepticism enters, that story begins to crack. You are forced to confront the possibility that some of your most cherished beliefs were not conclusions, but defenses, not discoveries, but shelters. That is not a small humiliation. It is a profound one, because it means the mind is not merely a window, it is also a theater. It stages meanings, it projects motives, it edits reality until the self can bear it. Sagan's discipline demands that we interrupt that performance. Consider what happens in ordinary life. Someone feels excluded and immediately concludes that others are hostile. Someone feels afraid and concludes that danger is everywhere. Someone feels drawn to a mysterious claim and assumes its mystery is a sign of depth. In each case, the feeling arrives first, the interpretation follows, the certainty hardens. But where in that sequence was truth actually tested? Where did the mind stop and ask whether its first reading of reality might be a disguised need. Most do not ask. Most simply proceed. This is the mechanism Sagan wanted to expose. Not because he believed people were stupid, but because he knew they were vulnerable. The more imaginative the mind, the more elaborate its self-deceptions can become. The more emotionally hungry the person, the more easily soothing falsehoods take root. And the more threatened identity feels, the more fiercely it protects its illusions. So skepticism must begin inward. Before questioning the world, question the instrument through which the world is interpreted. Before condemning collective irrationality, examine the smaller irrationalities that operate inside your own thought. What do you want to be true? What do you fear being false? What beliefs in you survive not because they were tested, but because they were needed? This is not self-hatred. It is intellectual adulthood. Sagan's greatness lies partly in his refusal to separate method from character. He understood that the search for truth requires virtues the modern world rarely honors: patience, restraint, humility, the ability to say, "I do not know," the ability to revise a belief without experiencing it as personal annihilation, the ability to stand in uncertainty without panicking into fantasy. These are not merely scientific skills, they are existential strengths. Most people do not fail truth because truth is inaccessible. They fail because discipline is expensive. It costs too much psychologically to remain open, provisional, alert to one's own error. It is easier to join a certainty, easier to inherit a conclusion, easier to consume a belief that already matches one's emotional appetite. Sagan rejects all of it. He demands that we become harder to fool, especially by ourselves. And this demand becomes even sharper when we recognize what is at stake. Self-deception is not a private flaw with private consequences. Entire civilizations can drift under its power. False certainties shape votes, wars, prejudices, cults, economies, educational systems, and futures. A mind that cannot question itself becomes easy to recruit into collective delusion. The personal weakness becomes a public danger. That is why Sagan's skepticism is not coldness. It is care, sharpened into method. He wants human beings protected from manipulation, but he knows the first defense is not faith in authority. It is trained doubt. Not doubt for its own sake, but doubt as a filter against illusion. Doubt as respect for reality. Doubt as discipline against vanity. The symbolic figure of Sagan becomes clearer here. He is not the man who kills wonder. He is the man who refuses to let wonder decay into gullibility. Through him, we see that reverence without scrutiny becomes superstition, and intelligence without self-criticism becomes arrogance. He stands between credulity and cynicism, demanding something rarer than both: clear sight. And clear sight begins with a brutal admission. You are not automatically trustworthy to yourself. Your mind can seduce you. Your longing can counterfeit evidence. Your fear can speak in the language of certainty. Until you grasp this, you are not yet searching for truth. You are searching for emotional survival. But once you do grasp it, another demand begins to rise. Because doubt alone is not enough. Suspicion alone is not enough. It is not sufficient to know that the mind can err. One must build a disciplined way of correcting those errors, testing claims, exposing illusions, and returning thought to reality with rigor rather than instinct. Clear thinking is not a luxury. It is a moral obligation. That is where Carl Sagan drives the argument after exposing the weakness of the human mind. If the brain can deceive itself, if certainty can be counterfeit, if desire can disguise itself as truth, then thought cannot remain a private habit without consequence. It becomes an ethical matter. It becomes a question of responsibility. Science, in this view, is not merely a collection of facts about stars, atoms, and galaxies. It is one of the deepest moral disciplines the human species has ever produced, because it teaches the mind how not to become a weapon against reality. Before many people understood the ethical force hidden inside scientific thinking, Sagan had already seen it with brutal clarity. He knew that error is never only intellectual. False belief can humiliate, manipulate, divide, and destroy. A civilization that cannot test its own claims becomes vulnerable not only to ignorance, but to cruelty organized by conviction. This is why Sagan refused to treat scientific method as a technical procedure limited to laboratories. He saw it as a disciplined form of conscience. Not conscience in the sentimental sense, but conscience as correction, conscience as self-limitation, conscience as the refusal to let longing, fear, vanity, or tribal need overrule the hard demands of evidence. What does it mean to say that lucid thought has an ethic? It means that the way you arrive at belief matters. It means that truth is not simply a private possession, but a public responsibility. It means that when you make claims about the world, you are not only expressing yourself, you are participating in the structure through which other minds may suffer, trust, obey, resist, or act. Sagan understood that bad thinking is never harmless for long. A falsehood inside one mind can become a contagion inside a society. And once falsehood acquires emotional force, institutional support, or collective panic, its consequences stop being theoretical. The first assertion lands with force. Science is not just data. The explanation follows immediately. Data alone can be collected by anyone, even by minds that remain arrogant, chaotic, or manipulative. What makes science distinct is not the possession of information, but the discipline of checking, questioning, testing, repeating, and exposing claims to possible failure. Science is a moral structure because it does not permit desire to crown itself king. It subjects ideas to resistance. It forces claims to survive contact with reality. The common misunderstanding is severe. Many people think science is merely a storehouse of answers, a decorated shelf of established facts waiting to be consumed. Sagan rejects that reduction completely. Science is not a museum of conclusions. It is a method of intellectual humility under pressure. And the conclusion cuts clean. A fact matters less than the disciplined path by which it was earned. The second assertion drives deeper. Science is a way of correcting the errors of the mind. The explanation sharpens. Human beings are not naturally objective. We project patterns where none exist. We mistake anecdote for law. We cling to explanations that flatter our emotions. Left alone, the mind drifts toward convenience. Science interrupts that drift. It builds procedures that force the thinker to face disconfirmation, peer criticism, replication, and revision. It creates a structure in which being wrong is not a humiliation to be hidden, but a condition to be discovered and corrected. The misunderstanding here is dangerous. People often imagine that science is powerful because scientists are smarter than everyone else. Sagan understood something more important. Science is powerful because it distrusts individual brilliance when that brilliance goes unchecked. It does not ask you to be flawless. It asks you to be accountable. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The strength of science lies not in perfect minds, but in disciplined self-correction. The third assertion cuts toward the ethical center. To think well is a responsibility to others. The explanation follows with increasing weight. If your beliefs influence how you vote, teach, parent, heal, accuse, punish, or trust, then your beliefs are not private ornaments. They shape the world. A careless mind can become a source of damage, not because it intends evil, but because error, armed with conviction, is often enough. Sagan saw that intellectual laziness and moral laziness are often the same weakness wearing different clothes. To accept claims without scrutiny, to spread certainty without evidence, to prefer emotional satisfaction over correction. These are not merely cognitive failures. They are failures of duty. The misunderstanding is flattering and common. People like to think morality concerns only intention. Sagan expands the frame. Intention matters, but so does method. Good motives cannot sanitize reckless thought. And the conclusion lands with severity. If you owe others honesty, then you also owe them rigor. This is the point where scientific thinking becomes almost ascetic. It asks the self to submit, to wait before concluding, to test before declaring, to revise before defending. That submission is painful because the ego wants ownership, not correction. It wants the thrill of being right, not the discipline of becoming less wrong. Sagan knew this conflict intimately. The human being is drawn towards certainty because certainty stabilizes identity. But the scientist, in his deepest sense, must learn another posture. He must learn loyalty to reality over loyalty to self. That is not a minor mental preference. It is a moral training. Why is this so difficult for most people? Because being corrected feels like being diminished. The ego interprets revision as defeat. It confuses the collapse of a belief with the collapse of the self. And so people defend conclusions long after evidence has turned against them. They protect narratives as if they were organs. They cling not because the claim remains true, but because surrender feels like humiliation. Sagan's ethic rejects this childish reflex. He demands a harder dignity. Not the dignity of always being right, but the dignity of being corrigible. The dignity of remaining open to evidence, even when evidence wounds your preferred story. Now, the modern condition makes this demand even sharper. In 2025, opinions move faster than thought. Claims spread before they are checked. Emotion outruns verification. Platforms reward confidence, not caution. Outrage travels farther than nuance. Under these conditions, lucid thought becomes even more clearly an ethical duty, because the cost of mental irresponsibility scales rapidly. One untested claim can distort millions of perceptions. One seductive lie can recruit entire communities. One counterfeit certainty can enter politics, medicine, education, and collective fear. Sagan would see the pattern immediately. The problem is not simply that falsehood exists. Falsehood has always existed. The problem is that modern systems amplify what the mind is already vulnerable to. They industrialize cognitive weakness. They reward simplification. They monetize certainty. They feed the appetite for belonging and emotional confirmation. Under such pressure, the scientific ethic is no longer merely admirable. It becomes a form of resistance against organized unreality. And that resistance begins inward, again with character. Because scientific thinking is not just a toolkit, it is a temperament. It requires patience in a culture of immediacy. It requires humility in a culture of display. It requires restraint in a culture of instant judgment. These are virtues before they are skills. Sagan grasped that deeply. He knew that you cannot build a civilization of critical thought on technique alone. You need people willing to endure uncertainty without panic, ambiguity without superstition, correction without narcissistic injury. This is why the ethic of lucid thought is inseparable from moral maturity. The immature mind asks, what belief makes me feel secure? The mature mind asks, what belief has survived real testing? The immature mind seeks intellectual possessions. The mature mind accepts intellectual responsibility. The immature mind wants a world arranged around its emotional comfort. The mature mind learns to serve truth, even when truth refuses comfort. Consider how radical this becomes when applied beyond science narrowly understood. A parent teaching a child, a citizen evaluating a leader, a teacher guiding a classroom, a friend giving advice. In every case, the moral value of thought becomes visible. Are you passing on conclusions because they are convenient, inherited, or emotionally pleasing? Or are you attempting, however imperfectly, to align your claims with evidence, complexity, and correction? Sagan's vision does not allow us to isolate science in laboratories while leaving ordinary life to intuition and impulse. He demands that the ethic of verification enter the bloodstream of civilization. This is also why criticism matters, not as cruelty, not as ego combat, but as a necessary tool of correction. A mind without critique becomes enclosed. An enclosed mind becomes dogmatic. Dogma then hardens into identity, and identity defended without evidence becomes one of the most dangerous forces in human affairs. Sagan saw peer review, debate, and skeptical scrutiny not as obstacles to truth, but as signs of respect for it. A claim that cannot survive questioning should not be trusted with power. This is true in science, and it is true in life. The human temptation, of course, is to hear criticism as hostility, to imagine that doubt is disrespect, to demand trust before evidence has earned it. But Sagan reverses the moral picture. It is not disrespectful to ask for proof. It is disrespectful to ask others to surrender reason for the sake of your comfort. It is not cruel to challenge a claim. It is cruel to let falsehood move unchecked where it may damage the vulnerable. Under this light, skepticism stops looking cold. It begins to look compassionate. Severe, yes, but compassionate in the only way reality permits. The symbolic figure of Sagan becomes sharper here. He is not just a defender of science. He is a defender of moral adulthood through science. Through him, scientific method becomes a human drama, a struggle between ego and correction, fantasy and evidence, emotional appetite and disciplined restraint. He does not worship data. He honors the ethical achievement of a mind willing to kneel before what is real. And still, this ethic remains fragile because truth alone does not automatically seduce the human heart. The false often arrives clothed in warmth, mystery, reassurance, and personal significance. The real often arrives demanding effort, humility, and the surrender of cherished illusions. That is why rational method must become character rather than mere technique. Otherwise, the mind will praise science in theory and betray it in practice, the moment a pleasing lie offers comfort. This is the fracture that begins to open next. If clear thought is an ethical duty, then why do so many intelligent people still drift toward nonsense? Why does error remain so emotionally magnetic? Why does illusion so often feel warmer than truth? Because the human being does not hunger only for accuracy. The human being also hungers to be soothed, chosen, noticed, protected by a universe it desperately wants to feel intimate. And that hunger gives falsehood one of its oldest and deepest seductions. Falsehood survives because it knows how to comfort what truth refuses to touch. That is where Carl Sagan presses next, and the pressure becomes almost unbearable. After showing that lucid thought is an ethical discipline, after insisting that science is not just a method, but a form of moral seriousness, he turns toward a darker fact about the human condition. Error is not merely a failure of intelligence. Often, it is an emotional refuge. People do not cling to nonsense only because they are uninformed. They cling to it because nonsense can feel intimate, protective, warm. It offers what reality often withholds. It tells the frightened mind that it is seen, the grieving mind that loss is reversible, the lonely mind that the universe is secretly personal, and the wounded ego that hidden forces are arranging meaning around its pain. This is why illusion is never defeated by ridicule alone. Ridicule attacks the surface. Sagan understood that the real roots go deeper. A false belief often functions like psychological shelter. It is not accepted because it is proven. It is accepted because it softens the cost of being human. It relieves uncertainty. It transforms chaos into pattern. It makes random suffering feel scripted. It gives pain an audience. And for a species terrified by silence, that is a powerful seduction. What does it mean for a belief to soothe before it explains? It means the mind has reversed its priorities. It no longer asks whether a claim is true. It asks whether a claim can be lived with, whether it protects identity, whether it reduces dread, whether it restores a sense of specialness to a creature humiliated by scale, mortality, and contingency. Sagan saw this with painful clarity. Many people do not seek knowledge. They seek rescue through narrative. And the more unbearable reality becomes, the more attractive, comforting distortions appear. The first assertion lands with force. Pseudoscience survives because it speaks the language of emotional need. The explanation follows immediately. Real science is often patient, provisional, restrained. It admits uncertainty. It corrects itself. It withholds dramatic promises until evidence earns them. Pseudoscience does the opposite. It arrives with certainty. It flatters intuition. It offers mystery without discipline, awe without method, and significance without proof. It tells the hearer what the hearer already longs to believe. The misunderstanding is common. People often imagine pseudoscience is merely bad science, a kind of technical failure. Sagan understood something more severe. It is often emotional theater disguised as knowledge. Its force comes not from rigor, but from seduction, and the conclusion cuts clean. A falsehood becomes dangerous when it stops trying to prove itself and starts trying to comfort the part of you that fears being ordinary. The second assertion drives deeper. Human beings crave enchantment more than they admit. The explanation sharpens. Modern life often appears disenchanted, mechanical, impersonal. Institutions feel cold. Data feels bloodless. The universe, as science reveals it, is majestic but indifferent. Under such conditions, many people begin to hunger for a more intimate cosmos. They want signs, hidden energies, secret correspondences, messages embedded in randomness. They want the world to speak directly to them. Sagan never mocked the hunger itself. He understood its depth. The mistake lies in surrendering truth to satisfy it. The misunderstanding here is subtle and widespread. People think rationality requires the destruction of wonder, so they turn to irrational systems to recover mystery. Sagan rejects this false choice. He insists that wonder disciplined by evidence is deeper than fantasy. But he also knows why fantasy wins so often. Fantasy personalizes the universe. Science does not. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Many lies endure because they make reality feel emotionally closer than it is. The third assertion cuts toward the wound beneath the wound. Superstition offers not only mystery, but protection. The explanation follows with weight. To live without guaranteed cosmic supervision is frightening. To accept mortality without hidden rescue is frightening. To face randomness without secret design is frightening. Systems of illusion step into that fear and promise shelter. They tell you that unseen forces are guiding events, that death is less final than it seems, that suffering is encrypted with purpose, that you are not merely one finite mind among billions, but a participant in a hidden order. The misunderstanding is dangerous because it sounds noble. People often defend such beliefs as harmless sources of hope. Sagan sees the cost more clearly. Hope detached from evidence can become dependency. Dependency on illusion weakens the muscles needed for truth. And the conclusion lands with full severity. A belief that protects you from reality may also prevent you from becoming strong enough to face it. This is where Sagan becomes psychologically ruthless. He is not attacking only fringe beliefs. He is exposing a mechanism inside the human soul. The need to be consoled can quietly overrule the need to be correct. Once that happens, the mind becomes recruitable. It no longer examines, it attaches. It no longer asks for proof, it asks for reassurance. And reassurance, unlike truth, can be manufactured endlessly. Why does this matter so much? Because a consoled mind is not necessarily a free mind. Often it is easier to govern, flatter, and manipulate. Once someone desperately needs the world to contain special messages for them, they become vulnerable to anyone offering access to those messages. The psychic, the cult leader, the ideologue, the manipulator, the charismatic fraud. All of them exploit the same fracture. They do not begin by teaching, they begin by soothing. They identify the wound and build authority inside it. Sagan saw that this was not a minor social problem. It was a civilizational danger. A public unable to distinguish disciplined wonder from emotional exploitation becomes easy prey. It will embrace claims that cannot survive examination, support authorities who profit from confusion, and gradually lose the habits required for intellectual self-defense. What begins as private consolation can become collective irrationality. Now, the modern condition makes this even more severe. In 2025, false comfort is no longer delivered only by fringe mystics or isolated doctrines. It is delivered by algorithms, communities of affirmation, endless streams of content designed to reward emotional certainty. Digital systems learn what fear keeps you engaged, what fantasy makes you feel chosen, what outrage gives you identity, what hidden knowledge flatters your loneliness. The old seduction has become more efficient. Illusion no longer waits for you to seek it. It arrives tailored to your wound. Sagan would have recognized the structure immediately. The forms have changed, the psychological mechanism has not. Human beings remain hungry for significance, protection, transcendence, intimacy with the cosmos. When reality does not provide these in the form they desire, they become susceptible to symbolic substitutes. And the substitutes often feel more alive than truth because they are built from the very materials truth does not promise: personal attention, emotional immediacy, narrative closure, secret belonging. This is why rational criticism alone so often fails. It attacks the claim, but ignores the hunger that gave the claim power. You can dismantle the argument, and the believer may still cling to it, because what is being defended is not merely an idea, it is a psychic shelter. To remove the belief without addressing the fear beneath it is to leave the person exposed. Sagan understood this. His severity was real, but it was not shallow. He knew that behind many irrational commitments stands a human being trying not to drown in insignificance. And this is precisely why his response matters. He does not answer false enchantment with sterile contempt. He answers it with a deeper, harsher wonder. He insists that reality itself is astonishing enough if the mind is strong enough to endure it. The stars need no hidden messages to be magnificent. Evolution needs no supernatural ornament to be profound. Consciousness emerging in a vast, indifferent cosmos is already an event of nearly unbearable beauty. But this beauty demands maturity. It does not flatter you. It does not promise that the universe arranged itself for your comfort. It asks whether you can love what is true without first requiring it to adore you. That is the real test. Can you accept a reality that does not kneel to your emotional needs? Can you remain open to awe without demanding cosmic intimacy? Can you face mystery without corrupting it into personal reassurance? Most people cannot, at least not consistently. They keep trying to reduce the universe into something parental, responsive, emotionally accessible. They want signs because signs restore relationship. An indifferent cosmos feels too much like abandonment. Now the existential depth becomes impossible to avoid. The human being does not only fear death, the human being fears not being addressed, not being held in mind by the structure of things. To be mortal is painful. To be mortal in an indifferent universe feels humiliating. It is the humiliation that drives so much irrational hunger. If no transcendent order guarantees that your suffering is noticed, then your suffering threatens to become private, finite, and perhaps cosmically mute. Many minds revolt against this possibility. Sagan does not deny the pain. He denies the right to falsify reality in order to escape it. That is the distinction. He refuses cheap consolation because he takes human dignity seriously. A being capable of science, reflection, and moral choice should not need to be deceived in order to continue. It should become strong enough to endure truth. Not because truth is gentle, but because adulthood requires it. This is his deepest confrontation with modern consciousness. Stop asking to be soothed first. Learn to see first. Consider the figure of Sagan as symbolic witness again. He stands before a culture addicted to sentiment and says that reverence without discipline becomes surrender. He stands before a frightened species and says that craving meaning does not entitle you to counterfeit it. He stands before grief and mystery and refuses both cynicism and superstition. Through him, we see that the mature soul does not kill wonder. It strips wonder of self-flattering lies. And yet, that stripping leaves a vacancy. Once false comforts are exposed, something must take their place, or the mind will run back to them. Human beings cannot live on negation alone. They need a mode of relationship to reality strong enough to bear beauty, sorrow, fragility, and finitude without fabrication. They need not only method, but inner stature, not merely skepticism, but courage. Because the final battle is no longer just against bad ideas. It is against the weakness in us that keeps begging for a more comforting universe than the real one. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to kneel before comforting lies. That is where Carl Sagan forces the human spirit once false consolation has been stripped away. After exposing how easily the mind trades truth for emotional shelter, after showing that illusion survives because it soothes what reality leaves raw, he turns toward the only force capable of standing inside that exposure without collapse. Not optimism, not faith in a hidden rescue, not sentimental resilience. Courage, a colder courage, a more disciplined courage. the kind that does not ask the universe to become warmer before the self agrees to face it. Before courage becomes heroic in the public imagination, it is something much harsher in the interior life. It is the decision to remain conscious in front of what humiliates you. It is the refusal to escape into fantasy when truth removes your importance, your guarantees, your metaphysical comfort. Sagan understood that the crisis of modern consciousness is not a lack of information. It is a deficit of inner strength. Human beings can discover astonishing truths about the universe, yet still remain psychologically too fragile to bear them. And when fragility meets reality, the temptation is immediate. Distort reality, personalize it, soften it, turn it into something survivable. Courage begins at the exact point where that temptation is denied. What does it mean to face reality without anesthesia? It means you do not demand that truth arrive in a form your emotions can easily digest. It means you do not confuse consolation with depth. It means you accept that some truths enlarge you only after they wound you. Sagan never presented reality as a gentle teacher. He knew better. Reality is often impersonal, disproportionate, silent in the face of the needs we most desperately want acknowledged. To face that without turning away requires more than curiosity. It requires character. The first assertion lands hard. Truth is emotionally expensive. The explanation follows with force. Human beings do not only seek knowledge, they seek stability, belonging, significance, assurance that their suffering is not random and their death not final. But disciplined truth often refuses to grant these things. It reveals vastness where we wanted intimacy, contingency where we wanted design, mortality where we wanted exemption. The misunderstanding is comforting and weak. People assume that if a truth causes distress, then something is wrong with the truth or with the way it is being told. Sagan rejects that softness. Some truths hurt because they remove illusions that were performing psychological labor. They do not become false because they are difficult, and the conclusion cuts clean. The pain of truth is not an argument against truth. It is often the cost of maturity. The second assertion goes deeper. Courage is not mainly physical. It is existential. The explanation sharpens. It is easy to imagine courage as battlefield action, visible sacrifice, dramatic endurance under public pressure. Sagan redirects the idea inward. Real courage may be quieter and far more demanding. It may be the willingness to say, "I do not know." It may be the willingness to let a cherished belief collapse. It may be the willingness to live without metaphysical guarantees. The misunderstanding here is persistent. People think courage means intensity, defiance, or theatrical confidence. But confidence can be counterfeit. Defiance can be vanity. Existential courage is different. It is restraint before uncertainty. It is steadiness before indifference. It is the refusal to corrupt reality for emotional relief. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The strongest mind is not the one that feels no fear. It is the one that refuses to let fear dictate what counts as real. The third assertion cuts toward the soul of Sagan's vision. Courage is the condition for intellectual honesty. The explanation follows without mercy. Without courage, the mind cannot remain open. It will rush to closure. It will choose the belief that protects identity, not the one that survives examination. It will hide inside systems that promise final answers. Sagan understood that dishonesty is often not rooted in malice, but in weakness. The mind lies because it is tired, frightened, humiliated by its smallness, unable to endure a universe that does not explain itself in emotionally satisfying terms. The misunderstanding is flattering. People imagine dishonesty begins when someone intends to deceive. Sagan sees a deeper layer. Often dishonesty begins when someone is too afraid to know. And the conclusion lands with full severity. If you lack courage, you do not merely risk believing lies, you become dependent on them. This is where the philosophical pressure becomes personal. Because courage, in Sagan's sense, is not abstract admiration for hard truths. It is a lived stance toward reality. It demands that you stand in front of scale without begging for importance, that you stand in front of death without inventing guarantees, that you stand in front of uncertainty without smuggling in false certainty to calm your nerves. This is not easy because the human organism is built to reduce distress, not to preserve truth at all costs. And yet, Sagan insists that adulthood begins exactly where this instinct is resisted. Why do so many people fail here? Because the psyche confuses truth with safety. It wants a world it can inhabit without trembling. It wants existence explained in terms that soothe attachment wounds, reduce cosmic shame, and convert private fear into universal promise. Under pressure, people do not merely believe what sounds plausible. They believe what feels inhabitable. And the real universe often feels too large, too cold, too silent to inhabit without pain. Courage is what allows a person to remain inside that pain without fleeing into spiritual decoration. This is why Sagan matters beyond science. He is not only teaching what to think about the cosmos, he is asking what kind of person can survive contact with reality without mutilating it. The question is ethical, psychological, almost ascetic. Can you become the sort of consciousness that does not need to be flattered by the universe in order to remain morally awake? Can you continue loving truth even when truth dismantles your specialness? Can you continue living seriously when no cosmic audience arrives to applaud your suffering? Now, the modern condition makes this even more difficult. In 2025, comfort has become instant, portable, algorithmically supplied. The mind is constantly offered emotional sedation disguised as content, identity, belonging, revelation. If one idea disturbs you, another arrives to reassure. If one truth destabilizes you, 100 narratives wait to restore your preferred self-image. Under such conditions, courage weakens, not because people are less intelligent, but because they are less practiced in enduring unsheltered reality. The nervous system becomes addicted to immediate consolation, and a mind addicted to consolation becomes hostile to truth the moment truth wounds. Sagan would see this immediately. A civilization flooded with stimulation and reassurance may still be inwardly weak. It may know more facts than any generation before it, and yet remain incapable of bearing the emotional consequences of those facts. This is the hidden crisis. Knowledge expands, but courage does not automatically grow with it. And where courage fails, the old seductions return. Mysticism without discipline, certainty without proof, hope without evidence, significance without effort. The market for illusion never dies, because the need for existential shelter never dies. But Sagan refuses to meet that need with fraud. He does something harder. He asks whether reality itself can become enough for a courageous mind. Not because reality comforts in the old way, but because facing it fully may generate a more severe form of dignity. A dignity not based on being chosen, but on being lucid. Not based on being protected, but on remaining responsible in an unprotected world. This is one of his deepest reversals. The universe does not have to guarantee your value for your courage to have value. In fact, courage becomes more meaningful precisely because it is exercised without cosmic reward. This is where the psychological depth of his vision becomes almost brutal. Many people do not actually want truth. They want a truth sized to their wounds, a truth that does not intensify loneliness, a truth that does not expose contingency, a truth that leaves self-importance intact. Sagan tears that demand apart. Truth does not report to your injuries. Reality is not a therapist. The cosmos is not arranged around human ache. And yet your response to this fact becomes one of the deepest revelations of your character. Do you become bitter when the universe refuses intimacy? Do you become nihilistic when it refuses guarantees? Do you punish life because it does not come pre-interpreted? Or do you become stronger, cleaner, less vain, more attentive to the fragile fact that consciousness can still choose honesty, tenderness, and discipline in the absence of any promise that these things will be rewarded from above? This is the real theater of courage, not the conquest of external enemies, but the conquest of inner cowardice. The cowardice that wants to be lied to beautifully. The cowardice that calls illusion spiritual depth because truth feels too thin without decoration. The cowardice that mistakes emotional warmth for metaphysical validity. Sagan does not humiliate this weakness for sport. He exposes it because he believes human beings can outgrow it. Not easily, not completely, but genuinely. Consider the symbolic force of Sagan himself. He stands before a species terrified by its own smallness and says that smallness is not defeat. He stands before mortality and does not bargain. He stands before silence and does not insert invented voices. Through him, courage becomes a form of reverence. To refuse falsehood, even when falsehood would soothe you, is to honor reality more deeply than superstition ever could. To remain open to wonder without falsifying the world into a personal theater is to become worthy of the consciousness you possess. And still, courage alone is not enough if it remains private. A person may endure truth inwardly, yet fail to transform that endurance into an ethic of living. This is where the next pressure begins. Because once you stop asking the universe to comfort you, another question rises with greater force. How should you live among other fragile beings who are equally finite, equally exposed, equally vulnerable to fear, illusion, and death? The answer cannot be domination. A species that understands its smallness has no justification for arrogance. The answer cannot be despair. Despair is only wounded vanity refusing to mature. The answer must be something harder, a form of solidarity born not from cosmic privilege, but from shared fragility. A morality that does not descend from the heavens already finished, but rises from the recognition that conscious beings in a vast indifferent universe owe one another something precisely because nothing else guarantees it. Solidarity is not born from comfort. It is born from exposure. Once Carl Sagan strips away the fantasy of cosmic privilege, once he denies us the narcotic of a universe arranged around human need, another demand rises with brutal clarity. If we are small, if we are fragile, if no celestial order guarantees justice on our behalf, then the burden returns to us. Not as a slogan, not as sentiment, as necessity. We owe one another something precisely because nothing in the structure of the cosmos promises that mercy, dignity, or care will appear on their own. This is where weak minds retreat into despair. They assume that if meaning is not handed down from above, then moral obligation loses its force. Sagan rejects that collapse completely. He sees the opposite. Moral seriousness becomes more urgent when there is no cosmic parent to correct our cruelty. If the universe does not intervene, then what happens between human beings matters more, not less. In a world without guaranteed rescue, tenderness becomes a human act of resistance. Justice becomes a constructed discipline. Compassion becomes a decision made in full view of indifference. What does it mean to build ethics without metaphysical comfort? It means you stop behaving as though goodness requires surveillance from the heavens. It means you stop needing reward to justify decency. It means you understand that another person's pain is not less real because no divine structure arrives to explain it. Sagan saw this with unusual precision. The mature human being does not need the promise of eternal accounting in order to reject cruelty. The mature human being sees fragility and answers it with responsibility. The first assertion cuts hard. Shared vulnerability is the ground of solidarity. The explanation follows with force. Every human being is finite. Every mind is breakable. Every life can be humiliated by loss, illness, isolation, error, grief, and death. We differ in history, power, temperament, and circumstance, but beneath all those layers stands a common condition. We are exposed creatures on a small world, trying to make meaning under pressure. The misunderstanding is common and corrosive. People think solidarity requires sameness. It does not. It requires recognition. It requires seeing that another person's vulnerability is not foreign to your own. And the conclusion lands clean. We do not owe each other care because we are identical. We owe it because we are equally perishable. The second assertion deepens the moral wound. Compassion is not softness, it is discipline against indifference. The explanation sharpens. In an indifferent universe, the easiest thing is to imitate that indifference, to become cold because the cosmos is cold, to become detached because suffering has no built-in explanation, to treat pain as trivial because reality offers no final consolation. Sagan refuses this surrender. He does not derive ethics from cosmic kindness, because cosmic kindness is not what the universe displays. He derives ethics from consciousness itself, from the fact that beings capable of suffering are also capable of recognizing suffering. The misunderstanding here is fatal. Many imagine compassion as emotional excess, as weakness, as a refusal to face hard truth. Sagan reveals something harsher. Compassion is what prevents truth from decaying into brutality. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. To know how fragile life is and still remain careless is not strength, it is failure. The third assertion strikes deeper. Humility is the beginning of moral proportion. The explanation follows with weight. Once human beings stop imagining themselves as cosmically central, arrogance loses its metaphysical costume. Dominion begins to look absurd. Vanity begins to look provincial. Tribal hatred begins to look grotesque on a planet so small and so endangered. Sagan's vision does not flatter the species, it disciplines it. He forces humanity to look at itself from a wider scale. And under that scale, many of our obsessions shrink into embarrassment. The misunderstanding is persistent. People think humility diminishes human importance. Sagan shows that humility rescues human importance from vanity. It teaches proportion. It teaches restraint. It teaches us that no one standing on this fragile planet has earned the right to behave as though they are gods. And the conclusion cuts clean. The species becomes more moral only when it becomes less self-intoxicated. Now the pressure turns inward again. Why is solidarity so difficult if vulnerability is universal? Because fear narrows the self. Pain makes people defensive. Mortality can produce not tenderness, but aggression. When human beings feel exposed, they often seek control. They harden into identity, ideology, domination, or contempt. They try to escape fragility by standing over someone else. This is one of the ugliest truths Sagan understood. Shared danger does not automatically produce unity. It can also produce scapegoating, delusion, and cruelty, unless consciousness is trained toward honesty and proportion. That is why moral maturity matters. It is not enough to know that all people suffer. One must learn how to let that knowledge alter one's conduct. One must refuse the temptation to turn private fear into public harm. One must resist the primitive urge to convert uncertainty into domination. Sagan's humanism is severe because it asks for this transformation without mythological shortcuts. He does not say we will become good because the universe has hidden moral architecture. He says we must become better because the absence of guaranteed moral architecture leaves the task in our hands. Now place this inside the modern world. In 2025, humanity is more connected than ever and still remains fragmented by fear, spectacle, resentment, and manipulated identity. Technology links minds without guaranteeing wisdom. Information spreads without ensuring compassion. Exposure to suffering does not automatically deepen conscience. Often, it numbs it. Under these conditions, solidarity becomes even more difficult and even more necessary, because fragility is now planetary. Environmental risk, war, disinformation, alienation, collective loneliness, technological exploitation. The species stands closer together than before, yet often behaves with less proportion than its vulnerability demands. Sagan would not answer this crisis with sentimental optimism. He would answer it with scale. Look again at the planet. Look again at how small it is. Look again at how temporary every boundary becomes from sufficient distance. This does not erase conflict, but it strips conflict of some of its arrogance. It reminds us that hatred on a dying speck is not grandeur, it is waste. Cruelty on a fragile world is not power, it is immaturity. This is where his ethical vision becomes almost unbearable in its simplicity. No one is coming to save us from being human. No cosmic judge will automatically repair what we destroy. No hidden plan guarantees that justice will survive our laziness. Therefore, responsibility grows heavier, not lighter. The child asks to be watched. The adult understands that being unwatched is precisely why character matters. Consider Sagan as a symbolic figure once more. He does not beg the stars to care more. He asks humanity to care better. He does not turn fragility into melodrama. He turns it into obligation. Through him, the moral life loses its theatrical decorations and becomes more exposed, more difficult, more honest. We are finite beings asked to act with dignity, not because eternity rewards it, but because consciousness without dignity becomes a danger to itself. And yet even this solidarity rests on something deeper still. Because to care for one another seriously, one must first understand what kind of creature the human being actually is. Not merely a social animal, not merely a rational machine, but a being suspended between wonder and fear, knowledge and illusion, tenderness and self-destruction. Until that inner structure is confronted, even our compassion remains unstable, our ethics incomplete, our solidarity vulnerable to collapse under the pressure of our own contradictions. Man is not only a creature who knows, he is a creature who can betray what he knows. That is where Carl Sagan's vision turns inward with even greater severity. After calling for solidarity among finite beings, after grounding moral responsibility in shared fragility rather than cosmic guarantee, the question sharpens into something more dangerous. What exactly is this being who must carry such responsibility? What kind of creature stands between wonder and destruction, capable of mapping galaxies and inventing lies, capable of tenderness and brutality within the same consciousness. Sagan does not romanticize the human animal. He examines it under hard light. And what emerges is not a noble essence, but a tension. Human nature is not stable innocence. It is divided. That is the first truth. We are capable of reason, but not ruled by it. We are capable of compassion, but not secured by it. We are capable of seeing reality, but we are equally capable of fleeing from it the moment it threatens our vanity, our comfort, or our fear. Sagan understood that the human mind is not a transparent instrument pointed toward truth. It is a battlefield of impulses. Curiosity pulls in one direction, ego in another. Wonder opens the self, fear closes it. Science disciplines the mind, but the undisciplined self never fully disappears. It waits, it distorts, it seduces. It makes even intelligence dangerous when intelligence is recruited by desire. What does it mean to be human under this pressure? It means you are never simply rational or irrational. You are both possibilities at once. It means your highest capacities do not erase your lower impulses. They coexist, they struggle, they contaminate each other. The same imagination that allows scientific discovery can also build conspiracy. The same need for meaning that inspires art and inquiry can also fuel superstition. The same tribal instinct that once preserved communities can become mass cruelty when inflated by fear. Sagan saw that human greatness and human ruin often emerge from the same source. A powerful mind without inner discipline does not become wise. It becomes more efficient at self-deception. The first assertion cuts directly. Human beings are not naturally aligned with truth. The explanation follows with force. Truth often demands restraint, patience, self-correction, and the surrender of flattering illusions. But the human organism is built to protect itself before it is built to understand itself. It seeks belonging before accuracy. It seeks security before honesty. It seeks meaning before evidence. This does not make humanity evil. It makes humanity unstable. The misunderstanding is common and sentimental. People imagine that if humans were simply educated enough, informed enough, exposed enough to facts, reason would naturally prevail. Sagan rejects that naivete. Information does not automatically defeat fear. Intelligence does not automatically defeat vanity. And the conclusion lands hard. A mind can know and still refuse. The second assertion goes deeper. The human being is a creature of contradiction. The explanation sharpens. We admire truth and resent it. We celebrate freedom and flee from responsibility. We speak of dignity while craving domination. We claim to seek knowledge while selectively protecting whatever confirms our preferred self-image. This contradiction is not accidental. It is structural. We are self-conscious creatures, burdened by mortality, vulnerability, and symbolic imagination. We know enough to fear death, but not enough to escape it. We know enough to long for cosmic meaning, but not enough to prove it exists. We know enough to suffer from our insignificance, yet still demand that reality compensate us for it. The misunderstanding here is dangerous. People often split humanity into the good and the corrupt, the rational and the irrational, the enlightened and the deluded. Sagan's view is more severe because it is more honest. The fracture runs through each individual, and the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The enemy of truth is not only outside you, it is built into the unstable architecture of being human. The third assertion strikes at the center. Reason is humanity's highest power precisely because it is not humanity's easiest habit. The explanation follows with weight. If reason were natural in the full sense, it would not require training, method, criticism, or courage. But it does. It must be cultivated against impulse, protected against group pressure, reinforced against the seductions of false certainty. Sagan understood that reason is not merely a tool the species possesses. It is an achievement the species must continually renew. The misunderstanding is flattering. People speak of rationality as if it were a trait one simply has. But rationality, in the deepest sense, is a discipline of self-confrontation. It requires that you resist your own hunger to believe what pleases you. And the conclusion cuts clean. To be capable of reason is not the same as living by it. This is why the human being remains dangerous, even at the height of knowledge. The same species that sends instruments beyond planets can still fall to tribal myth, cultic thinking, mass delusion, and emotional manipulation. Progress in knowledge does not erase ancient instability. It only increases the scale of consequence. A primitive fear, armed with advanced technology, becomes more destructive, not less. Sagan saw this clearly. The crisis of humanity is not that we lack intelligence. It is that intelligence outruns wisdom. Power outruns proportion, and symbolic capacity outruns moral maturity. Now the psychological depth becomes harder to avoid. Why does the human being betray what he knows? Because knowledge alone does not master fear. A person can understand the value of truth and still choose the lie that protects identity. A person can speak of solidarity and still become cruel under pressure. A person can admire reason and still surrender to resentment when reason threatens his cherished illusions. This is the humiliating truth. Consciousness does not free us from struggle. It intensifies it. Because once you know better, your failures stop being innocent. They become divided acts. One part of you sees, another part refuses. This division is where the drama of human nature truly lives, not in public ideology, not in abstract theory. In the interior collision between lucidity and evasion, between the part of the self that wants to know and the part that wants to survive psychologically at any cost. Sagan does not sentimentalize this collision. He treats it as the central problem of adulthood. Can a being aware of its own instability become disciplined enough to prevent its fear from governing its world? Now place this in the modern condition. In 2025, humanity is more self-aware in language and more fragmented in spirits. People speak constantly of mental life, identity, trauma, authenticity, consciousness. Yet, self-knowledge often remains shallow. Individuals describe themselves endlessly while confronting themselves rarely. The vocabulary of introspection grows, but the discipline of inner honesty does not always grow with it. Sagan would see the danger immediately. A species fluent in self-expression, but weak in self-examination, becomes easier, not harder, to manipulate. It confuses disclosure with truth. It mistakes intensity for depth. It performs awareness without enduring the pain of real correction. This is why Sagan's anthropology remains severe. To understand the human being, one must strip away both religious vanity and modern therapeutic vanity. Man is neither a fallen angel nor a self-creating hero. He is a finite, unstable intelligence trying to become worthy of its own powers. Through him, we see that dignity is not an inheritance. It is a task, not something granted by nature in finished form, but something built through discipline against the chaos already present within us. Consider Sagan himself as a figure again. He does not speak to humanity as though it were innocent. He speaks to it as something dangerous and magnificent at once. Through him, the human species appears almost tragic, capable of awe, but easily corrupted by fantasy, capable of love, but prone to domination, capable of understanding the stars, but still vulnerable to the oldest terrors of the tribe. This is not cause for despair. It is cause for vigilance, because a creature this divided cannot afford self-worship. And from here, another pressure begins to rise. If human nature is unstable, if the mind can split against itself, if reason must be cultivated against fear and illusion, then the decisive question is no longer only what man is. It becomes what kind of inner discipline can prevent this divided creature from collapsing under the weight of his own powers. Discipline is not repression. It is the architecture that keeps power from becoming ruin. That is where Carl Sagan drives the argument. Once the divided nature of man has been exposed, if the human being is unstable, if reason is real but not sovereign, if fear and fantasy can hijack intelligence from within, then no amount of raw capacity can save us. Capacity without form becomes danger. Knowledge without discipline becomes arrogance. Power without inner order becomes catastrophe. What matters then is not whether humanity can think, but whether humanity can govern the conditions under which thought remains honest. Before this question became urgent for a technological civilization, Sagan had already seen its shape. He understood that the central crisis was no longer simple ignorance. It was misalignment. Human powers were accelerating faster than human maturity. Our instruments were becoming more exact while our motives remained confused. Our ability to alter the world was expanding, while our ability to examine ourselves lagged behind. This is not a minor imbalance. It is a civilizational fracture. Because once a species can act on a planetary scale, inner disorder is no longer private. It becomes historical. What does it mean to impose discipline on a creature as divided as man? It does not mean crushing emotion or sterilizing wonder. Sagan never argued for a mechanical soul. He argued for a soul capable of correction. Discipline, in his deepest sense, means building habits that keep fear from impersonating truth. It means creating methods, institutions, and inner standards strong enough to interrupt self-deception before self-deception becomes action. It means forcing the mind to pass through rigor before it is allowed to claim certainty. The first assertion lands with force. Human power grows faster than human wisdom. The explanation follows without softness. Our species has learned to manipulate energy, decode matter, engineer systems, and extend its reach beyond what earlier ages could imagine. But technical ability does not automatically purify intention. The same mind that can investigate reality can also weaponize it. The same intelligence that can illuminate can dominate. Sagan saw that this asymmetry defines the danger of modern humanity. We become more capable long before we become more proportionate. The misunderstanding is common and flattering. People assume that advancement in knowledge naturally means advancement in character. It does not. History repeatedly shows the opposite. A civilization may become more informed while remaining morally juvenile. And the conclusion cuts clean. Progress in capacity without progress in discipline only increases the scale of possible damage. The second assertion goes deeper. Inner discipline begins with intellectual restraint. The explanation sharpens. The divided human being wants to conclude too quickly, identify too completely with belief, and defend too aggressively what is not earned defense. Discipline interrupts these impulses. It teaches the mind to wait, to test, to revise, to hold uncertainty without collapsing into panic or dogma. Sagan's model is severe because it asks the self to become less spontaneous in its claims and more deliberate in its allegiance to evidence. The misunderstanding here is predictable. Many people hear restraint and imagine lifelessness, as though disciplined thought kills vitality. Sagan reveals the opposite. Undisciplined thought is not vitality. It is drift. It is susceptibility. It leaves the mind open to every fear that can disguise itself as revelation. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Freedom of thought without discipline quickly becomes captivity to impulse. The third assertion strikes at the social dimension. No individual discipline is enough unless it is reinforced by collective structures of correction. The explanation follows with weight. Human beings are poor judges of themselves when left alone with their convictions. That is why criticism matters. That is why evidence matters. That is why institutions of testing, scrutiny, disagreement, and revision matter. Sagan never treated objectivity as a personal virtue one simply possesses in purity. He understood it as a difficult achievement sustained by method and community. The misunderstanding is dangerous. People often imagine inner sincerity is enough to guarantee truth. But sincerity can be fully present inside a delusion. What protects us is not intensity of belief, but structures that expose belief to possible failure. And the conclusion lands hard. A species that rejects correction does not become free. It becomes reckless. This is where discipline reveals its existential burden. It requires the ego to accept limits. It requires the self to live under standards it did not invent merely for its own comfort. It requires that one part of the mind restrain another. And this is why discipline feels hostile to so many, because it challenges the fantasy that authenticity means unfiltered expression. Sagan would reject that fantasy immediately. The unfiltered self is not automatically truthful. Very often, it is only unexamined. Real seriousness begins when the self stops celebrating its impulses and starts interrogating them. Why is this so difficult? Because discipline always costs something. It costs immediacy. It costs vanity. It costs the emotional pleasure of certainty. It costs the intoxicating feeling that one's instincts are enough. Human beings resist discipline not only because it is hard, but because it humiliates them. It reveals that they cannot be trusted completely without method, that their own minds require supervision, that spontaneity is not innocence. This is the offense discipline delivers to the ego. It tells the self that good intention is insufficient. Now place this inside the modern condition. In 2025, power has become intimate. Individuals hold tools of influence once reserved for institutions. Language can scale instantly. Images can deceive instantly. Outrage can mobilize instantly. Under these conditions, inner disorder becomes socially explosive. A frightened or vain mind can now distribute its distortions at extraordinary speed. Sagan would see here the absolute necessity of discipline, not as elitism, not as rigidity, as survival. Because when reach expands, self-correction can no longer remain optional. This is also why Sagan's vision resists both authoritarian control and chaotic subjectivism. He does not ask for obedience to dogma. He asks for obedience to reality tested through method. He does not trust unrestrained feeling, but he also does not worship institutions blindly. He demands something harder than either submission or rebellion. He demands a culture in which claims must earn their place through evidence, and in which minds are educated not merely to express, but to examine. At the psychological level, this changes the meaning of maturity. Maturity is not confidence. It is governability of the self. It is the capacity to feel fear without letting fear become doctrine. It is the capacity to feel wonder without letting wonder degrade into credulity. It is the capacity to possess power without turning that power into self-worship. Through Sagan, discipline stops looking like denial and starts looking like the only structure capable of protecting truth from the appetite of the ego. Consider again the symbolic force of Sagan himself. He is not merely curious, he is ordered. He is not merely open-minded, he is selective under pressure. He does not permit every possibility equal dignity simply because it can be imagined. Through him, we see that the mature intelligence is not one that welcomes all ideas indiscriminately, but one that knows how to test, reject, suspend, and refine. This is not coldness. It is care sharpened into structure. And yet, even discipline is not the final answer, because discipline can govern thought, but it cannot by itself explain why the struggle matters so much. Why should a fragile species labor so intensely to think clearly, act responsibly, and resist illusion? Why not surrender to comfort? Why not let the self drift into whatever narrative feels easiest to inhabit? The question grows sharper precisely because discipline is costly. Sagan's deeper answer begins to emerge at this point. The struggle matters because consciousness itself is rare enough to deserve defense. Because truth, however harsh, is still a higher relationship to reality than fantasy. Because a being capable of knowing the universe should not willingly reduce itself to a prisoner of its own emotional hunger. And because every act of discipline is also an act of protection around something precious and easily lost. What then is being protected? Not merely accuracy, something more fragile, more elevated, more dangerous, the dignity of consciousness itself. Consciousness is the most fragile grandeur the universe has produced. That is where Carl Sagan brings the argument after discipline, after skepticism, after the long refusal of illusion. If human beings must learn restraint, if thought must be trained against fear and vanity, if reason must be protected from the inner chaos that constantly threatens it, then one question rises above all the others. What exactly is worth protecting with such severity? The answer is not comfort, not pride, not the ego's fantasy of cosmic importance. It is consciousness itself, the rare and dangerous fact that matter, for a brief moment, has become aware of itself. Before many were ready to face the full existential weight of science, Sagan had already seen that consciousness is not a decorative feature of existence. It is one of its most astonishing events. Out of lifeless particles, blind processes, ancient explosions, and indifferent physical law, something emerged that can ask questions, feel wonder, anticipate death, and look back at the stars from which it came. This does not prove that the universe loves us. It proves something stranger. It proves that reality, without intention to comfort, has still given rise to beings capable of understanding part of its structure. That fact alone should wound our arrogance and elevate our seriousness at the same time. What does it mean for consciousness to have dignity? It does not mean that every thought is noble or every feeling profound. Sagan would reject that laziness immediately. Consciousness has dignity not because it is always right, but because it is capable of truth. Not because it is pure, but because it can correct itself. Not because it is central, but because it is rare enough that its destruction should matter. Dignity here is not a compliment. It is a burden. It means that awareness carries responsibility. A mind that can know the world, distort the world, love within the world, or damage the world, cannot be treated as trivial. The first assertion lands with force. Consciousness is precious because it is finite. The explanation follows without softness. Human awareness does not endure forever. It flickers into being, struggles with confusion, pain, longing, and ignorance, and then disappears. This brevity is not a flaw added to consciousness from outside. It is part of what gives consciousness its intensity. A finite mind experiences beauty differently because it can lose it. It experiences love differently because death stands behind it. It experiences truth differently because the time to know is limited. The misunderstanding is common and emotionally weak. People assume that value must come from permanence. Sagan rejects that instinct. The temporary is not worthless because it ends. Often it matters because it ends. And the conclusion cuts clean. Mortality does not erase the dignity of consciousness. It reveals how easily that dignity can be squandered. The second assertion goes deeper. Consciousness is the universe becoming visible to itself. The explanation sharpens. A star burns without knowing it burns. A galaxy turns without knowing it turns. Matter obeys law without reflection. But in conscious life, something changes. The world is no longer merely happening. It is being witnessed. Through minds, the cosmos becomes legible in fragments. Through minds, blind existence produces awareness, memory, interpretation, grief, insight, and wonder. Sagan saw this not as mystical inflation, but as disciplined astonishment. The misunderstanding here is dangerous. Some hear this and rush back into spiritual vanity, imagining that because consciousness is extraordinary, humanity must therefore be chosen. Sagan refuses that leap. Extraordinary does not mean favored. It means improbable, delicate, deserving of care. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. To damage consciousness carelessly is to damage one of the rarest achievements reality has produced. The third assertion strikes at the moral center. The dignity of consciousness depends on how it is used. The explanation follows with weight. Awareness by itself is not virtue. Human consciousness can become lucid, compassionate, and truthful. It can also become manipulative, cruel, deluded, and predatory. The power to know includes the power to deceive. The power to imagine includes the power to falsify. Sagan understood that consciousness does not justify itself automatically. It must earn its dignity through relation to truth, to restraint, to solidarity, to responsibility for other conscious beings. The misunderstanding is flattering. People think human worth is guaranteed merely by being human. Sagan makes the picture harder. Capacity gives possibility, not fulfillment. A mind worthy of defense must struggle not to become a weapon against reality or against others. And the conclusion lands hard. Consciousness is sacred only if one is willing to use that word in the severest sense, meaning something that must not be wasted through vanity, cruelty, or lies. Now the pressure turns inward. Why do we so often degrade our own consciousness? Because the mind prefers comfort to clarity, identity to revision, stimulation to depth. It exhausts itself on distraction. It sells itself to ideology. It lets fear shrink its field of vision. It becomes entertained by triviality while carrying within it the power to contemplate galaxies, mortality, justice, and the shape of truth. This is one of Sagan's deepest accusations against modern life. Not merely that people are wrong, but that they so often use consciousness beneath its level. They reduce a magnificent instrument to tribal reaction, spectacle, resentment, and appetite. In 2025, this degradation has only become more intimate. Attention is fragmented continuously. Thought is interrupted before it deepens. Language is accelerated until it loses weight. The mind is pulled outward by systems designed to monetize distraction and emotional reflex. Under such pressure, consciousness becomes thin, not absent, thinned, capable of outrage, consumption, and performance, yet less capable of sustained reflection. Sagan would see this as a civilizational danger because what is threatened is not only knowledge, it is interior stature. A species that cannot protect the quality of its own awareness will eventually lose proportion in everything else. This is why wonder matters in his thought, but only disciplined wonder. Wonder expands consciousness beyond vanity. It reminds the self that reality is larger than its private injuries and cravings. But wonder without rigor becomes superstition. Wonder without truth becomes self-flattering theater. Sagan's achievement was to hold both together. He defended wonder because consciousness requires enlargement. But he defended discipline because enlargement without correction becomes delusion. Through him, consciousness is neither a mystical spark to be idolized nor a mechanical process to be trivialized. It is a fragile form of participation in reality. Consider the symbolic force of Sagan himself again. He looks at the stars without kneeling to fantasy. He honors the human mind without inflating the human ego. He treats consciousness as precious while refusing to sentimentalize it. Through him, we see that the mature response to being aware is neither pride nor despair. It is stewardship. To be conscious is to inherit a task. Protect the integrity of perception. Protect the capacity for wonder. Protect the discipline that keeps truth from dissolving into need. Protect other minds from cruelty, because each mind is another site where the universe has briefly become aware. And yet this protection remains incomplete unless it answers one final pressure. If consciousness is fragile, finite, and morally serious, then the deepest question is no longer merely what it is. The deeper question is how a conscious being should live so that awareness does not end in waste. Not how to survive only, not how to feel only, but how to shape a life that does not betray the rare dignity it has been given for so brief a time. At that point, thought can no longer remain content with awe, skepticism, or discipline alone. It is forced toward judgment, toward choice, toward the difficult demand of deciding what kind of life is worthy of a being who knows it will die and yet can still choose how to stand beneath the stars. A worthy life is not measured by comfort. It is measured by whether consciousness was used with honesty before it disappeared. That is where Carl Sagan's entire vision tightens into its final demand. After stripping away cosmic vanity, after exposing illusion, after defending science, courage, discipline, and the fragile dignity of awareness, the question can no longer be postponed. How should a finite being live in a universe that offers no guaranteed consolation and no pre-written moral script? Sagan does not answer with sentiment. He answers with severity. Live in a way that does not betray the rare fact that you were able to know at all. What does it mean to live worthily under the stars? It does not mean to conquer the world. It does not mean to accumulate pleasure, status, or applause. It means to align your brief existence with truth rather than fantasy, with responsibility rather than self-worship, with wonder rather than numbness, and with care rather than domination. Sagan understood that once divine guarantees are removed, every human life stands more exposed. Nothing outside you can automatically redeem waste, cruelty, blindness, or cowardice. The shape of a life becomes more serious precisely because there is no cosmic excuse waiting to soften it. The first assertion lands with force. A good life begins in intellectual honesty. The explanation follows immediately. A consciousness that spends itself protecting lies, clinging to false comfort, or manipulating reality into a flattering story has already degraded its own dignity. It may survive, it may succeed by public standards, but inwardly it has chosen anesthesia over lucidity. Sagan would reject that life as a lesser use of awareness. The misunderstanding is common and deeply modern. People think a good life is one that feels affirming, secure, or emotionally sustainable. Sagan cuts through that weakness. A life can feel soothing and still be false. It can feel successful and still be empty of seriousness. And the conclusion cuts clean. To live well, you must first refuse to live by what you know has not earned your belief. The second assertion goes deeper. A worthy life does not merely know truth, it acts under its weight. The explanation sharpens. Knowledge that remains private, decorative, or performative changes nothing. You may understand fragility and still be cruel. You may admire the cosmos and still live vainly. You may speak of reason and still surrender daily to resentment, ego, and distraction. Sagan does not let awareness become a trophy. He turns it into obligation. If you know how brief life is, then your conduct toward other finite beings matters more. If you know how vulnerable the mind is to falsehood, then your relation to evidence matters more. If you know consciousness is rare, then wasting it on triviality, hatred, or self-delusion becomes not merely unfortunate, but shameful. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The good life is not a feeling of meaning. It is a discipline of alignment. The third assertion strikes at the center. Meaning is not found by being important to the universe. It is forged by becoming responsible within it. The explanation follows with weight. Human beings keep asking whether their lives matter on a cosmic scale, as if value must arrive from above or it does not exist. Sagan rejects that childish hunger. The universe does not need to assign your worth for your actions to carry moral gravity. Value emerges when a conscious being chooses truth over illusion, care over indifference, and disciplined wonder over empty appetite. The misunderstanding here is fatal. People hear that the universe is indifferent and assume that all lives are therefore equally hollow. Sagan exposes the laziness in that conclusion. Indifference at the cosmic level does not erase responsibility at the human level. it intensifies it. And the conclusion lands hard. Your life matters not because reality guarantees it, but because you decide whether your brief awareness will become a site of honesty or waste. This is where Sagan's philosophy becomes almost ruthless in its clarity. He leaves no room for grandiose self-deception. You are small. Your life is short. Your death is certain. Your mind is vulnerable to error. Your species is capable of astonishing beauty and astonishing stupidity. And within all of that, you are still required to choose, not once, repeatedly, in the use of your attention, in the rigor of your thought, in the mercy or carelessness of your actions, in the kind of truth you can bear without corrupting it into something easier. Why do so many fail this demand? Because a worthy life is harder than a pleasurable one. It asks more of the self than instinct naturally wants to give. It asks for proportion when ego wants centrality. It asks for humility when vanity wants distinction. It asks for moral steadiness when the nervous system wants relief. And perhaps most painfully, it asks for seriousness without guarantee. No final voice promises that your effort will be rewarded. No hidden script assures you that your fidelity to truth will spare you sorrow. You must live well without being bribed. That is one of Sagan's hardest lessons. Moral adulthood begins where reward stops being the primary motive. A child behaves well when watched. A deeper human being acts with integrity because reality does not become less real when no one is applauding. In 2025, this lesson becomes even more severe. Modern life offers endless means of appearing profound, informed, compassionate, and awake without actually becoming any of those things. Performance expands while substance thins. Identity becomes theatrical. Conviction becomes public style. Sagan would tear through this immediately. A worthy life is not built from display. It is built from inner proportion that remains when spectacle is gone. This is why attention matters so much in his vision. What you repeatedly attend to becomes the climate of your consciousness. If you live in distraction, your mind becomes shallow. If you live in false certainty, your mind becomes rigid. If you live in resentment, your mind becomes narrow. But if you train attention toward truth, complexity, beauty, and disciplined sympathy, the inner life acquires weight. Not comfort, weight. And weight is what keeps a person from being carried away by every emotional wind. Consider again the symbolic figure of Sagan. He is not simply telling humanity to admire the stars. He is demanding that under the stars we become less childish. Through him, wonder becomes an ethical test. Can you face immensity without collapsing into vanity or despair? Can you accept mortality without becoming trivial? Can you recognize your species as one fragile expression of consciousness and still choose to live with restraint, honesty, and care? Through him, the question of life stops being romantic. It becomes exacting. And still, there is no final consolation here. Sagan does not promise completion. A good life, in his sense, is not a finished state one arrives at and keeps. It is an ongoing fidelity, a repeated correction, a sustained refusal to betray what you have seen. You will remain vulnerable to fear. You will remain tempted by illusion. You will remain finite, divided, and unfinished. But that does not reduce the seriousness of the task. It defines it. This is where everything converges: science, skepticism, courage, humility, solidarity, discipline, consciousness. Not as separate virtues, but as one demand. Use your brief awareness well. Do not spend it flattering yourself. Do not spend it fleeing from what is true. Do not spend it making the world darker for other minds equally trapped in finitude. Let your life become proportionate to the reality that produced it: severe, lucid, compassionate, and awake. And once that demand is accepted, one final movement begins to rise from beneath it. Because if a life is judged by how it uses consciousness, then what remains is not merely to describe that standard, but to gather the entire struggle into a final reckoning about what Sagan leaves behind for anyone still willing to think without anesthesia. Truth does not promise comfort. Carl Sagan never asked it to. He knew the universe was not made to console human longing, not built to confirm our importance, not arranged to hand us meaning in finished form. And yet he refused the lazy conclusion that silence makes life empty. His greatness lies exactly there. He looked into the indifference of the cosmos and still demanded responsibility, restraint, wonder, and moral seriousness from the human being. What did Sagan leave us? Not a warm illusion, not a final answer, not a universe wrapped in purpose for our emotional convenience. He left something harder and more valuable: a way of standing upright inside uncertainty, a way of loving truth without asking truth to flatter us first, a way of seeing that science is not the enemy of meaning, but one of the last disciplines that can keep meaning from collapsing into fantasy. He was not naive about human nature. He knew how easily the mind deceives itself. He knew how quickly fear turns into dogma, how often loneliness turns into superstition, how dangerously intelligence can serve destruction when it is not governed by humility. But he also knew this: human beings are still capable of dignity, not because we are central, because we are conscious, because we can know that we are small and still choose not to become cruel, because we can face a silent universe and still refuse to live as if nothing matters. This is the force of his legacy. The truth may be cold, but it is not meaningless. The universe may be indifferent, but that does not free us from ethical responsibility. It intensifies it. If no one is coming from outside to rescue us, then our treatment of one another becomes more serious. If meaning is not handed down, then every act of honesty, every act of compassion, every act of disciplined thought carries more weight, not less. Sagan does not let us hide in certainty. He does not let us hide in despair either. He strips both away. What remains is harder. A human life lived without cosmic privilege, but not without moral obligation. A mind that does not know everything, but still refuses blind surrender. A species that may never receive final answers, but can still choose whether it will live with arrogance or with humility, with delusion or with lucidity, with violence or with care. And that is why Carl Sagan endures. He did not promise us a meaningful universe. He showed us how to become worthy inside one that does not promise anything at all.